There is a wall of sandstone and eucalyptus rising west of Sydney that for the better part of a century told engineers exactly what they could not do: the Blue Mountains, a geological barrier so severe, so sheer, so indifferent to human ambition that the colony of New South Wales spent the first decades of its railway age staring at them the way a man stares at a locked door he has lost the key to. And yet, in 1867, a locomotive climbed that wall, not quietly, not gently. With fire in its belly and steel on its wheels, it dragged a train of passenger carriages up a gradient so steep that conventional railway wisdom said a steam locomotive could not grip the rails. Engineers in London had looked at the surveys and shaken their heads. The route was physically impossible, they said. The grades were too severe, the curves too tight, the altitude gain too brutal. They were wrong, but the story of how they were proven wrong is not simply a story of engineering triumph. It is a story of a single machine, built and refined in Sydney, that became the unlikely answer to a problem the rest of the world had already given up on solving. The Blue Mountains begin their ascent roughly 80 kilometers west of Sydney. To anyone who has made the drive today, the climb feels almost unremarkable. A modern highway, engineered with sweeping grades, tunnels bored through the hardest stone, viaducts that barely acknowledge the valleys beneath them, but strip away 150 years of civil engineering and stand at the foot of those escarpments with a locomotive, a set of iron rails, and a promise to connect the coastal capital to the interior wheat plains beyond Bathurst. And the mountain looks completely different. It looks like an impossibility. The gradient at the steepest section approached 1 in 42. That number might seem abstract, without context, so consider this. The standard British railway guidebooks of the era recommended that mainline grades should never exceed 1 in 200. 1 in 42 was not just ambitious, it was, by every prevailing standard, reckless. The engineers knew it, the New South Wales government knew it, and the board of directors of the Sydney Railway Company, watching construction costs mount and progress stall, knew it with particular and desperate clarity. The solution they ultimately chose was not a locomotive. Not at first, it was geometry. The great zigzag at Lapston Hill, and later, the far more celebrated Great Zigzag at Lithgow, was a masterpiece of controlled retreat. The idea was simple in principle, staggering in execution. Rather than climbing the escarpment in a single direct assault, the line would advance up to a platform cut into the hillside, then reverse, the locomotive driving in the opposite direction, pushing the train further up a second set of rails, then reversing again onto the next level. 3 legs of track, 2 reversals, 1 mountain. It was elegant in the way that all great engineering compromises are elegant, by admitting what you cannot do and finding a brilliant way around it. But a zigzag is only as good as the locomotive that works it, and that is where this story changes direction entirely. The locomotives operating on the New South Wales Main Western Line in the early 1860s were, to be fair to them, never designed for what was being asked of them. They had been built in England, the standard 240 tender engines that the British Railways had evolved for relatively flat lines through the Midlands and the North. They were adequate machines in their native context. On the Blue Mountains, they were not adequate. They slipped on the grades. They overheated on the long ascents. Their tractive effort, the raw pulling power that determines whether a locomotive conquers a grade or stalls upon it, was marginal at best when confronted with the zigzag's demands. Train loads had to be split. Pilot locomotives were added. What should have been a single departure from Sydney became an exercise in staging and restaging, with the mountains routinely defeating schedules that the timetable printers in the city had optimistically committed to paper. The answer came from Everleigh. The Everleigh Railway Workshops, established in the inner Sydney suburb of the same name, had begun as a maintenance facility, a place to repair and service the imported English engines that formed the backbone of the colonial fleet. But by the late 1860s, something more ambitious was taking shape within those workshops. Colonial engineers, men who had spent years watching English locomotives fail the specific and unforgiving demands of Australian terrain, had begun to ask a different question. Not, what machine can we buy, but what machine can we build? The result was a class of 240 tender locomotives that the record books note almost in passing, e'en as if their significance were self-evident and required no elaboration. They were not glamorous. They were not the largest locomotives in the colony, nor the fastest, nor the most technologically novel. What they were was precisely calibrated to the problem at hand. Their boiler pressure had been increased above the English standard. Their driving wheels were slightly smaller in diameter, which sacrificed top speed, but increased the mechanical advantage on the grade. Their valve gear had been adjusted to produce maximum tractive effort at the low speeds that zigzag working demanded. On paper, the changes were incremental. On the zigzag, they were transformative. The first full revenue working of an Everleigh modified locomotive over the complete Great Zigzag at Lithgow took place on a morning in October 1869. The records describe the grade in terse operational language, but the physical reality of that working must have been extraordinary. The locomotive's exhaust cracking against the sandstone cliffs like rifle shots, the smell of hot oil and coal smoke drifting down the valley below, the passengers gripping the brass handles of their compartment doors as the train reversed and reversed again, and then crested the summit into the orange plateau light above. It cleared the grade without a pilot. It did not split the train. It worked to the timetable. The crew logged it as routine. The superintendent's report that week contains a single line acknowledging that the new engines were performing satisfactorily on the mountain section. The kind of language men used in that era when they were trying not to appear too impressed by something that had astonished them. Word spread quickly through the operational ranks. Drivers who had spent years coaxing underpowered English machines up the zigzag with white knuckles and short prayers now had something that answered them when they opened the regulator. Firemen found the steaming rates manageable, where the older engines had burned through coal reserves, just fighting the grade. The new locomotives arrived at the summit with pressure still in hand. This matters because in the economics of a colonial railway, performance efficiency was not an abstraction. Every ton of coal burned above budget. Every minute of delay accumulated at passing loops. Every additional pilot locomotive required on a grade. All of it fed back into the financial position of a railway system that was permanently short of money and permanently overpromised to a government demanding faster, cheaper, more reliable service to the interior. The zigzag itself would not survive forever. By 1910, The New South Wales Railways had bored 10 tunnels through the Blue Mountains and replaced the reversals with the Great Deviation through Lithgow, a conventional main line that made the old zigzag look like what it was, a brilliant but temporary answer to a problem that engineering would eventually solve outright. But the zigzag era lasted more than 40 years, and for most of that time, the machines that made it work were Sydney machines, Evelay machines. Yet locomotives designed not in London drawing offices for generic conditions, but in a colonial workshop by men who had learned the mountain's character through years of failure and frustration. The irony is sharp. The Blue Mountains were crossed, ultimately, by the same logic that built the zigzag in the first place. Not brute force, not blind optimism, but precise and honest reckoning with the specific nature of the obstacle. The zigzag asked the mountain to cooperate with geometry. The Evelay locomotives asked the mountain to respect engineering, and for 4 decades it did. What gets remembered and what does not is rarely a question of merit. The Union Pacific big boy fills museum halls and documentary reels because it is vast, because it is American, because its story fits the narrative of a nation that built big and celebrated bigness. The Evelay locomotives that worked the Blue Mountains zigzag are footnotes, in archives, in specialist journals, in the memories of the handful of historians who have traced their operational records through the New South Wales State Archives. But the mountains were conquered. The wheat of the Bathurst Plains reached the Sydney wharves. The colony, then the nation, was stitched together rail by rail across terrain that the imported machines and imported expertise had declared impassable. And somewhere at the center of that story, largely invisible to the broader historical record, is a locomotive designed in an inner Sydney suburb by engineers whose names we have mostly lost, performing a task that the world said could not be done. The Blue Mountains are still there, of course. The escarpment has not changed. The sandstone cliffs are exactly as indifferent to human ambition as they were in 1867. The trains that cross them today do so in minutes, through tunnels and across viaducts, without a single reversal, without a second thought. But once, before the tunnels, before the deviations, before the modern electrified main Western line was even imaginable, there was a machine. There was a grade. There was a column of smoke rising against that sandstone wall. And the locomotive, built by Australians for Australia, did not stop. That is what the mountain remembers, even if history mostly doesn't.